I was pressing a fresh shirt I had no particular occasion to wear that week, an old habit from 31 years spent making certain I always looked composed enough for whatever a grieving family might need, when the small rural cemetery's own office called to confirm, carefully and a little apologetically, whether I had authorized the sale of 2 plots within my own family's deeded section. I remember setting the iron down slowly, a faint curl of steam still rising from the fabric, right before that question rearranged the entire shape of that afternoon. I had authorized no such sale, not once in any conversation with anyone. And within the following week, I would learn that my daughter-in-law had quietly listed 2 specific plots, ones I had reserved decades earlier for 2 grandchildren not yet born at the time, believing them simply unused space, rather than a deliberate promise I had made and documented long before either of those children ever existed. My name is Adeline Pemberton. I'm 77 years old. I spent 31 years as a funeral director, the kind of career that teaches you that a resting place carries a specific, permanent weight that cannot simply be treated as available inventory, and teaches you, too, that the small decisions a family makes decades in advance often matter more than anyone realizes until the actual moment they're needed. My husband Alistair died 9 years ago. A sudden aneurysm, quiet and without warning, while sitting in his own reading chair on an ordinary Thursday evening. I remember coming in to ask if he wanted tea and finding him already gone, his glasses still resting on his nose. Grief that arrives in the middle of something so quietly ordinary teaches you something particular. It teaches you that an empty reading chair can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn slowly to keep visiting the place where he actually rests now, because the alternative is letting that visiting stop entirely. Alistair's own family established our small cemetery plot 4 generations ago, 12 spaces in a modest rural cemetery just outside town, and over the decades, as family members passed, those spaces filled gradually, always with careful thought, given to who belonged where. When Alistair and I married, we discussed, early on, exactly how we wanted the remaining spaces eventually used, and after our own children began having children of their own, I formally documented, with the cemetery's own association, exactly which remaining spaces were reserved for which specific descendants, including 2 spaces set aside years before either of the grandchildren who would eventually need them was even born. I did this deliberately, understanding from my own career exactly how much confusion and pain could result when a family failed to plan these things clearly in advance. After Alistair died, tending that plot and understanding its exact, careful arrangement became something closer to sacred to me, the clearest remaining trace of decisions we had made together specifically to protect our family, long after we were both gone ourselves. Alistair and I built our life together slowly, the unglamorous way most honest things get built. He worked as a stonemason for nearly 40 years, meticulous with every headstone he carved, the kind of man who believed a family's grief deserved lettering cut by hand rather than machine, no matter how much longer it took. When I told him, 4 years into our marriage, that I wanted to pursue formal mortuary science training rather than continue as his own part-time bookkeeper, he didn't tell me it would be difficult with 2 small children at home. He told me he'd handle every school pickup and every dinner on my longest training weeks, and he did for years, without complaint. I built my own career slowly after that, the way most honest expertise gets built, one carefully guided family at a time, 31 years in the profession, until I finally retired with more patience than I sometimes believed I had any right to feel. I remember one particular young apprentice early in my own career, a man convinced he'd never develop the composure needed to sit with a family in their very worst moment, whom I spent an entire year quietly mentoring after our shared shifts, never once mentioning to the funeral home's owner how much extra time it actually required. He went on to run a respected practice of his own for over 2 decades, and years later, a letter arrived thanking me for refusing to let him give up on his own instincts. I think about that letter often now, in a different light than I once did, understanding that quiet, uncredited mentorship had always been the actual substance of my working life, long before anyone in my own family learned to take my own judgment for granted. Alistair didn't live to see how carefully that plot's own documentation would eventually need defending again. He died 9 years before Rosamond's own involvement began, and some evenings I still catch myself wanting to ask him what he thinks of a particular decision before remembering there's no one on the other end of that particular conversation anymore. I have 2 children. Clementine, my daughter, is a hospice chaplain, 3 time zones away, gentle and exacting in exactly the way you'd hope someone in that particular calling would be. She calls every Sunday evening, without fail, a habit that started the year Alastair died and never once lapsed since. My son Aurelio is 44, an accountant married for 6 years to a woman named Rosamond Fenn, 36, whose growing role managing the family's own paperwork and finances as I've gotten older, he has supported personally, and who has always had a particular gift for making her own practical decisions sound like simple common sense. Rosamond grew up in a family that treated any unused resource, financial or otherwise, as something requiring active correction rather than something that might simply be reserved deliberately for a future purpose not yet realized. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's discomfort with reserved, unused space comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep accepting that discomfort indefinitely, especially once it starts threatening a promise I made to my own grandchildren before either of them could even understand what that promise actually meant. She told me a story once, early in her relationship with Aurelio, back when we still spoke easily and often, about her own parents' habit of immediately reselling any inherited item nobody in the family was actively using. Believing sentiment alone was never sufficient reason to hold on to something with real market value. My parents always said an unused thing was just money sitting still, she told me. I grew up believing that reserving something for a future that hadn't arrived yet was simply a failure to be practical. I remember thinking at the time that it reflected a certain clear-eyed resourcefulness in her, worthy of real admiration. I didn't yet understand that she had absorbed an entire framework built around treating reserved space as inherently wasteful, and that a promise I had made to grandchildren not yet born would eventually become the thing that framework was applied to, without my consent. My own days since retiring had settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm. Coffee at my own kitchen table most mornings, an hour or two tending my own small garden, the occasional visit from a former colleague looking to catch up. It was, by most measures, a peaceful life, one I'd built carefully in the years since Alistair died, and one that made an ordinary phone call from a cemetery clerk feel, at first, like nothing more than a routine annual check-in. Aurelio met Rosamond through mutual friends at a dinner party, and I remember the first time he brought her by my house, watching her ask thoughtful, practical questions about how I managed the household's various accounts and paperwork on my own. Questions that suggested genuine helpfulness rather than idle curiosity. I remember thinking, watching that first visit, how naturally capable she seemed, exactly the kind of steady presence a family could rely on. I would think about that first visit considerably more in a different light, once I understood how selectively that same capability eventually got applied. About 3 years ago, as I began finding some of my own paperwork increasingly tedious to manage alone, Rosamond offered to help organize my financial records and various family documents, genuinely useful at first, helping me track down old insurance paperwork and organize decades of accumulated files. I welcomed her help warmly, grateful for another set of capable hands managing details I found increasingly overwhelming. I did mention early on that the cemetery documentation specifically should never be altered or acted upon without speaking with me directly first, given how carefully those particular decisions had been made. She told me she understood completely. It would take 3 years of careful, creeping erosion before I understood exactly how much that understanding had actually meant. For the first 2 years, everything felt like exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Rosamond's help genuinely useful, the cemetery documentation untouched and clearly filed exactly where I'd always kept it. The first time I noticed something beginning to shift was when Rosamond mentioned, almost as an aside while helping me organize yet another box of old records, that she'd noticed the family plot included what she described as two unclaimed spaces, and asked, casually, whether those spaces might eventually be worth selling if nobody in the family actually intended to use them. I sat with that comment for a long moment, understanding immediately that she had misread carefully reserved space as simple vacancy, though I told myself in that moment that I had clearly explained the reservation and she surely wouldn't act on a misunderstanding I'd already corrected. The second incident happened when I discovered entirely by accident that Rosamond had contacted the cemetery's own office directly, inquiring about the general process for transferring or selling individual plots within a family section, framing the inquiry as simply gathering information rather than anything she intended to act on without my direct involvement. The cemetery's own clerk, appropriately cautious given that my name alone appeared as the documented decision maker for that section, mentioned the inquiry to me during an unrelated call about annual maintenance fees. I had to sit with that information for a long time, understanding exactly how far that particular curiosity had already progressed without my full knowledge. The third incident happened when Rosamond mentioned to Aurelio in a conversation I happened to overhear that she thought it might make sense to eventually reallocate the two reserved spaces toward funding something more immediately useful for the family, framing the idea as practical resourcefulness rather than a departure from a decision I had made and documented decades earlier. I mentioned to Aurelio, gently, that I found the growing conversation about those particular spaces increasingly uncomfortable. He told me Rosamond simply thought practically about unused assets, and that surely it didn't really matter as long as nothing was actually decided without me. The fourth incident happened when I overheard Rosamond describing the family plot, in conversation with a friend visiting our home, as having some genuinely underutilized space that the family hadn't fully thought through, language that made no mention of the specific, deliberate reservation I had documented for two grandchildren who would someday actually need those spaces themselves. I mentioned to Aurelio gently that I found the growing public discussion of those specific spaces increasingly uncomfortable. He told me Rosamond simply talked openly about practical family matters and that surely it didn't really matter exactly how she described it to friends outside the family. The fifth incident happened during an ordinary visit, when Rosamond mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd spoken further with the cemetery office and learned that unused family plots could, in fact, be formally released and resold with the documented decision maker's proper authorization, and asked whether I'd be willing to at least consider it, given how much the current real estate market for cemetery space had apparently increased in value. Adeline, you understand, right? She said, glancing at me with a practiced, reasonable smile. It's not about disrespecting anything. It's just about being practical with something that's just sitting there. I sat there listening to my daughter-in-law discuss releasing spaces I had reserved specifically for two grandchildren, as though decades of careful, deliberate planning were an inconvenient oversight, rather than the very promise those spaces existed to keep. The sixth incident happened when Rosamond's own mother, meeting me at a family gathering, mentioned how impressed she was watching her daughter handle practical family matters with such clear eyed sensibility. She's always had that gift, she said, beaming, foreseeing past sentiment to what actually makes sense. I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else directly, though I remember driving home afterward, feeling the particular loneliness of being the only person in an entire extended family who actually understood what those two specific spaces had been reserved to protect. The seventh incident is the one I think about most, because it's the one where I should have said something more directly and didn't. It happened when I mentioned to Aurelio, plainly, that I intended to keep the plot exactly as I had documented it decades earlier, that both reserved spaces would remain exactly where they were for whichever grandchildren eventually needed them. He told me he understood completely and would make certain Rosamond understood as well. I believed him, not yet realizing that understanding and formally ensuring nothing happened without my direct authorization were about to become two very different things in this particular situation. The eighth incident happened when I discovered, reviewing the Cemetery Association's own correspondence out of habit, that Rosamond had requested a formal appraisal of the two spaces' current market value, a request that required no direct authorization to initiate, but that nonetheless suggested she was actively pricing something I had never agreed could be sold at all. I sat with that discovery for a long time, understanding that whatever had been building had likely already progressed further than I'd initially realized. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment something feels wrong. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. Rosamond is just being practical the way capable people are. Aurelio loves me, even if he doesn't correct her firmly enough. She would never actually act without my direct authorization, and that should be enough. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that a promise I had made to my own future grandchildren, before either of them could even understand it, had become something someone else felt entitled to quietly reconsider. There was one afternoon, about a month before everything finally came to a head, when I came close to addressing this more directly. Rosamond mentioned during an ordinary phone call that she'd found a simple release form the Cemetery Association used for exactly this kind of transfer, and offered to have it ready in case I ever wanted to discuss the option further, framing the offer as simple preparedness rather than something requiring my actual formal consent first. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying, out loud, exactly how uncomfortable this pattern had become. Then I thought about Aurelio's own happiness, about how much he valued his wife's practical initiative, about how a direct confrontation might feel like an attack on something he genuinely appreciated about her. I let the comment pass and told myself, one more time, that the moment to address this fully hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came the phone call. The cemetery's own clerk, a careful man named Ezekiel Thorne, who had managed the small association's records for over a decade, called on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, his own voice carrying a practiced carefulness I recognized immediately from years of handling sensitive conversations myself. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said, "I wanted to speak with you directly before proceeding with anything. We received a listing request last week for 2 plots within your family's section, submitted with documentation suggesting your authorization, but something in the paperwork felt inconsistent enough with our own records that I wanted to confirm directly with you before moving forward. I set the iron down slowly, the shirt still resting on the board in front of me. Mr. Thorne, I said carefully, I authorized no such listing. Can you tell me exactly what was submitted and by whom? He described the request in detail, a formal listing for the 2 specific plots I had reserved decades earlier, submitted with Rosamond's own signature as an authorized family representative, though no formal authorization from me had ever actually been filed, granting her that authority. I need you to treat this as an unauthorized action, I told him, my own training from decades of handling sensitive family matters rising up instinctively. Please withdraw the listing entirely and direct me to whatever formal process your association has for confirming and permanently protecting the original reservation on those spaces. Mr. Thorne confirmed he would do exactly that and explained that the association's own board would likely want additional documentation from me directly, given the seriousness of an unauthorized listing involving a permanently reserved family space. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and sat at my own kitchen table for a long time afterward, understanding with a clarity that arrived all at once exactly what I needed to do next. I called my old friend Philippa before I called my attorney, a woman I'd worked alongside for over 2 decades in the same regional funeral home, needing to hear a voice that understood exactly how much a reserved, permanent space actually mattered to a family. I told her the whole story, 3 years of gradual pressure, the unauthorized listing, my own conversation with the cemetery's own clerk. She listened without interrupting, her own tea going cold in front of her. Adeline, she finally said, you spent 31 years making certain grieving families understood exactly what a resting place actually protected and why those decisions deserved to be honored exactly as made. I don't think that principle stops applying just because the person disregarding it happens to be family herself. I keep waiting to feel guilty about what I'm about to do, I told her, and it isn't coming. Maybe it isn't coming, Philippa said, because there's nothing here to feel guilty about. You didn't create a complicated family situation. You're simply refusing to let a promise you made to your own grandchildren get quietly sold out from under them before either of them ever even knew it existed. I called my attorney, a sharp, long-time professional acquaintance named Theodora Winslet, whom I'd worked with years earlier during an estate matter involving a difficult family dispute. I explained the pattern plainly: 3 years of gradual pressure, the unauthorized cemetery inquiry, and now an actual unauthorized listing submitted with a signature claiming authority Rosamond had never actually been granted. Adeline, she said, this moves well beyond an uncomfortable family conversation. Submitting a listing for a permanently reserved family space, using signed documentation claiming authority that was never formally granted, is a serious matter. Let's document everything properly, and let's discuss exactly how you want to proceed. Those first few days after the phone call were harder than I expected. I found myself more than once reaching for the phone to call Theodora and tell her to hold off, that surely there was some gentler way to make my point without formally reconfirming anything through legal channels. I visited the small cemetery myself one entire afternoon, standing quietly beside Alastair's own headstone, trying to remind myself exactly what I was protecting before I let the decision go any further. Each time, I made myself sit with the discomfort a little longer instead of acting on it, remembering Philippa's words, remembering the actual weight of Mr. Thorne's careful phone call, remembering that gentler corrections had already had 3 years to work, and hadn't. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do because I think it matters. I did not seek any criminal complaint against Rosamond, nor did I act out of pure anger. Theodora and I worked with the Cemetery Association directly to formally, permanently reconfirm the original reservation on both spaces, adding an explicit notarized restriction requiring my own direct, verified signature for any future modification of any kind, regardless of who else might attempt to initiate such a request. I had her also draft a formal brief letter to Aurelio and Rosamond confirming exactly what had been established and why, along with a factual accounting of the unauthorized listing itself. I sent that letter through her office with the Cemetery Association's own documentation attached, the same plain, factual language that could have applied to any property matter between any two parties, anywhere in the state. Aurelio called the following morning, his voice tight with shock rather than his usual calm. Mom, Rosamond is telling me this is a misunderstanding, that she thought she had your general blessing to explore the idea and didn't realize the actual listing had gone through without your direct sign-off. I understand that's difficult to hear, I said calmly, but someone submitted a formal listing with a signature claiming authority she was never actually granted, for two spaces I reserved specifically for your own children before either of them was even born. That isn't a misunderstanding, Aurelio. That's exactly the kind of situation a cemetery association's own verification process exists to catch. There has to be some explanation that doesn't involve deliberately acting without your knowledge. I'm genuinely open to hearing one, I said, but it needs to come with a clear accounting of exactly how that listing was prepared and submitted and why. I'm not interested in destroying this family over this. I'm interested in making absolutely certain nothing like it can ever happen again. Rosamond called 2 days later, her voice sharp. Adeline, this is being blown completely out of proportion. I was only trying to explore a practical option that seemed reasonable to me. No, I said quietly. I'm the woman who received a call from her own cemetery's own clerk because you submitted a listing for spaces I reserved for your own children, using a signature claiming authority you were never actually given. I think the real question is where you believe that authority actually came from. I didn't think it would move forward without your final approval. I thought exploring the option was harmless. Then I trust you'll cooperate fully with my attorney's request for a clear accounting of exactly how that listing was prepared, I said. Because right now, the Cemetery Association's own records show a formal, signed submission, and that isn't something either of us gets to simply reframe as harmless exploration. She hung up on me. I sat with the dial tone for a long moment, then went back to my own kitchen table, understanding that whatever came next would take considerable time to settle. The weeks that followed were difficult ones. Aurelio called nearly every day at first, caught between his wife's insistence that this had all been innocent and a growing understanding of exactly how serious the actual documentation suggested it had been. Clementine, once she heard the whole story, offered to fly in and sit with Aurelio directly, walking him through exactly what those two spaces had always represented, the way only a sibling in hospice ministry herself could properly convey the actual weight of what had nearly happened. She told me later that she'd shared with him several stories from her own work, families who'd suffered genuine, prolonged confusion simply because a decision that should have been documented clearly hadn't been. Watching her brother's face change as he connected those stories directly to what their own mother had spent decades trying to prevent. I don't think he understood how much real pain that kind of unclear planning actually causes until he heard it described from someone who sits with grieving families every single week, Clementine told me. He kept saying, I thought Mom was just being sentimental about it. She wasn't being sentimental, Clementine told him. She was being exactly as careful as her entire career taught her to be. About 2 weeks after my letter went out, Aurelio asked if I'd be willing to sit down with him and Rosamond together, along with Theodora present, before anything proceeded any further. I agreed, genuinely hoping we could establish exactly what had happened without permanently fracturing this family. When the meeting began, Aurelio sat across from me at Theodora's own conference table. Rosamond beside him, her expression carefully arranged into something between contrition and defensiveness. "Mom," Aurelio began, "we wanted to sit down properly and figure out what actually happened here." "I'm listening," I said. Rosamond spoke first, her voice tighter than I'd heard it before. I found the listing form and filled it out myself, using information I already had access to from helping with the family paperwork. And I signed as an authorized representative because I genuinely believed. Exploring the option was something you generally agreed I could look into. I know now that submitting an actual signed listing was wrong, but I never meant for it to be treated as though I'd tried to steal something. I considered that admission carefully before responding. Signing a document claiming authority you were never actually granted, and submitting it to a cemetery association regarding permanently reserved family spaces is a serious matter regardless of intention. I understand you may not have set out believing you were doing something wrong, but that's precisely what the document you submitted actually represented. I could lose Aurelio's trust in me entirely over this, Rosamond said, her composure cracking. "Is that really what you wanted?" "What I wanted," I said, "was for a promise I made to my own grandchildren, before either of them could even understand it, to remain exactly that, a promise, until I chose to change it myself, through the same careful process I originally used to establish it. I never once asked you to manage that process on my behalf. I only asked repeatedly and clearly that my own decision be respected as final." Aurelio was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned toward Rosamond directly, his voice low but clear enough for Theodora and me both to hear. "You signed a document claiming authority Mom never gave you," he said. "That's not a practical suggestion gone slightly wrong. That's something else entirely, and I need you to understand the difference before we can move forward from this at all." Rosamond's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire meeting, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. "I don't know how to fix something I let my own practical instincts turn into," she said, almost to herself. "You start by fully cooperating with whatever accountability this actually requires," I told her. "With the Cemetery Association and with this family." Given Rosamond's full cooperation, her formal written acknowledgement of exactly what she had done, and her genuine willingness to help correct the record properly, Theodora and I agreed not to pursue any further formal action, though the incident remained permanently documented with the Cemetery Association, establishing beyond any future dispute exactly what had actually occurred and exactly how firmly the original reservation had been reconfirmed. About 3 weeks later, Aurelio came to see me alone, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table. "I keep thinking about how completely I failed to take your discomfort seriously months ago," he said, "when you first mentioned finding the conversation about those spaces uncomfortable. I told myself Rosamond just thought practically, and I never once stopped to ask whether that practicality had already crossed a line." "Thank you for saying that now," I told him. "Why didn't I take it seriously sooner?" he asked, mostly to himself. "You told me directly, more than once, and I still didn't act. Because you wanted to believe the people you love wouldn't actually cross a line like that," I said gently. "That's not a foolish thing to want. It's simply not the same thing as verifying that they haven't." Rosamond came to see me on her own several weeks later, considerably more subdued than our earlier confrontation had been, sitting stiffly across from me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about how close I came to actually damaging something permanent, and what that would have meant for whichever grandchildren eventually needed those spaces, she admitted, before we'd even gotten to the harder parts of the conversation. I know I have complicated feelings about how this happened, Adeline, but some part of this was just about genuinely wanting to feel useful and capable in this family. That desire is entirely understandable, I told her gently. I never doubted your genuine capability or your desire to help. I only ever wanted my own actual decisions about something this permanent to remain mine to make, through an honest process, rather than something quietly explored on my behalf. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and continued. I've been thinking about everything, she admitted, about how easily wanting to feel useful turned into believing I was entitled to simply act on an idea I hadn't fully thought through. I think I convinced myself that asking you directly, formally, risked a no I couldn't easily work around, so I found a way that felt like exploring rather than deciding. You were never entitled to bypass me, Rosamond, I told her, but you were always entitled to ask me directly, honestly, about what those spaces actually meant and why they'd been reserved the way they were. Those are very different paths, and only one of them was ever available to you. I don't know how to undo what I did, she said. You don't undo it, I told her. You account for it fully, which you have, and then you spend considerable time afterward proving, through small, consistent honesty, that you understand exactly why the original decision mattered as much as it did. Can I ask you something? She said. Why did those two spaces matter so much to you specifically, beyond simply being reserved? I told her, honestly, about the years I'd spent standing beside grieving families who hadn't planned clearly enough in advance, watching confusion and unnecessary pain compound genuine grief, simply because nobody had made the hard, deliberate decisions early enough. I never wanted that confusion for my own grandchildren, I told her. Those two spaces were never simply unused ground. They were a promise that when the day eventually comes, however far off that is, nobody in this family will have to wonder where they belong. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon about Alistair, about the plot itself, about what genuine planning for a family's future actually meant. I showed her the original documentation I'd filed decades earlier, my own careful handwriting explaining exactly why each remaining space had been designated the way it was. Rosamond read through those pages slowly, her hands careful, before asking if she could help me update the documentation properly now, adding her own name as a secondary contact who could help coordinate with the Cemetery Association, provided any actual decision always required my own direct authorization first. By the end of that conversation, something between us had shifted, not fully repaired, but genuinely, honestly begun. Aurelio and Rosamond began seeing a counselor together that autumn, specifically to address the underlying assumptions driving how they approached family planning and long-term decisions, something neither of them had properly examined before. Rosamond told me later that the counselor had asked them, in an early session, to describe the single biggest unspoken assumption underlying how they approached practical family matters. We both said efficiency. Almost at the same time, Rosamond said. Neither of us had ever said out loud how much of what we called efficiency actually meant quietly bypassing decisions that were never ours alone to make. I called Theodora a few weeks after the initial meeting to update her on how everything had actually unfolded, since the family's own accountability process had moved forward faster than either of us expected. Adeline, I've handled a lot of these situations over the years, she said, and I can tell you what you did wasn't reckless. It was actually one of the more disciplined responses to an unauthorized action I've seen a client execute in 20 years of practice. I told her I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that it had felt in the moment more like an act of pure alarm than discipline. Sometimes the two aren't as far apart as people assume, she said. You understood, from the moment you established that reservation decades ago, exactly how easily a family's own careful planning can be quietly undermined if the documentation isn't treated with total seriousness. The fact that you eventually needed to enforce that seriousness doesn't make you any less careful for having built it properly in the first place. Clementine flew in for that year's holiday gathering, the first time in years that both of my children had gathered under one roof at once. My own dining room filled with the smell of a roast and the sound of easy conversation that hadn't existed at any family gathering in longer than I cared to admit. Aurelio and Rosamond drove over with a pie Rosamond had made herself. No elaborate presentation, just a slightly uneven crust. She laughed about setting down on my counter. Over dinner, Clementine's husband Cornelius asked, innocently enough, how the whole situation had eventually settled, clearly having heard only fragments of the story secondhand. The table went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to precede something painful in this family, before Rosamond simply said, I let wanting to feel practical and useful turn into something I'm not proud of, and Adeline handled it with more grace than I honestly deserved. We're doing this properly now together. Nobody laughed uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. Cornelius, genuinely curious rather than unkind, asked Rosamond how it had felt realizing the truth so directly. Rosamond was quiet for a moment before answering honestly. Humbling isn't a strong enough word, she said. I think I finally understood what it costs a family when you let practical instinct replace an honest understanding of what actually belongs to whom and why. I appreciated that she didn't try to soften the admission for the sake of a pleasant holiday table. Rosamond called her own mother that same autumn, correcting at last the impression she'd left at that earlier family gathering. Aurelio told me she'd come off the phone looking wrung out, describing her mother's reaction as a long, uncomfortable silence, followed by a quiet admission that she'd always privately wondered whether calling reserved family space unclaimed had actually been fair to the people who'd deliberately chosen to set it aside. She sent me a brief note not long after, considerably more restrained than Aurelio's or Rosamond's own, but genuine in its own careful way, thanking me for correcting a picture of the family's situation she'd simply accepted without ever asking directly. A few weeks after that gathering, a card arrived in my mailbox, Aurelio's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written only a few lines. Mom, I keep thinking about all the months I let Rosamond's practical instincts go unaddressed instead of taking your own discomfort seriously the first time you mentioned it. I can't undo that, but I can promise to actually listen the moment you tell me something feels wrong from now on, rather than assuming it will simply resolve itself. Thank you for handling something this serious with more patience than I think I would have managed myself. Tucked inside the same envelope was a smaller note in Rosamond's own handwriting, brief and considerably more humble than anything she'd ever said to me directly. Adeline, I let practicality turn into something genuinely careless, and I'm still working to understand fully what that could have cost this family someday. Thank you for handling it in a way that gave me the chance to actually make it right, instead of simply losing everyone's trust. I folded both notes carefully and placed them in a small drawer beside the original cemetery documentation I'd filed decades earlier, a small permanent record of exactly how seriously that early carelessness had needed to be taken. Theodora and I finalized the newly reinforced documentation that following spring, established through an entirely new, properly notarized process, with Rosamond present throughout every step, watching honestly and transparently exactly how a legitimate decision about something permanent actually gets made and protected. I called Mr. Thorne directly that same spring, once everything had been properly resolved, to thank him for taking his own verification process seriously enough to call me before proceeding with anything. Mrs. Pemberton, he told me, I've managed this association's records for over a decade, and I can tell you, most families never actually get that call, because most inconsistencies aren't quite as easy to catch as this one turned out to be. I told him I appreciated more than he probably realized exactly how much that careful attention had actually protected. I saw Philippa again that spring, over coffee at the same small cafe, where we'd talked through everything the week. The cemetery first called. I told her about the resolution, the counseling, the newly reinforced documentation. Philippa listened with the same quiet satisfaction she'd shown from the very beginning. I told you it would matter, catching that discrepancy the moment you noticed it, she said. Most people don't take something like that seriously enough, even when their own instincts are practically shouting at them. You did. And look what it actually protected. Not just the plots, the whole family's honesty going forward. I thought about that phrase for days afterward, understanding that it described exactly what had actually been at stake the whole time. Do you regret any of it? Philippa asked gently, reporting it as formally as you did. I don't regret any of it, I told her. I regret that it took an actual unauthorized listing for any of us to have an honest conversation about what those spaces genuinely meant. I think I needed that alarm in some strange way to finally understand exactly what my own careful documentation had been protecting all along. I think about that phone call from Mr. Thorne often, my own iron still resting on the ironing board, his careful voice explaining exactly what had been submitted. At the moment, it felt like the beginning of something frightening. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something considerably more honest. A family finally required to reckon directly with an assumption it had been quietly acting on instead of naming. I don't regret establishing that reservation the way I did decades ago. Protecting my grandchildren's own future certainty mattered to me then, and it still does now. What I regret is how long I allowed the small, uncomfortable signs of encroachment to go unaddressed before I finally insisted the record reflect what I had actually decided. Real family planning was never meant to require quiet manipulation to protect, and I intend to make certain every decision I make about something this permanent remains genuinely mine through an honest process for as long as I'm able to make it. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that quiet discomfort was something to simply manage privately rather than something requiring a firm, immediate response. I no longer believe that. Tolerating small encroachments in silence isn't patience. It's simply a slower, quieter kind of vulnerability, and it costs exactly as much in the end whether you name it out loud or not. The difference is only in how much damage accumulates before you finally do. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The offhand comment about unclaimed spaces, the unauthorized inquiry to the cemetery's own office, the conversation with a friend that stopped mentioning why those spaces actually mattered. Each one seemed small enough to excuse in isolation. Strung together, they formed something considerably less innocent, a pattern deliberate enough that I no longer believe, looking back, that the eventual listing was an isolated lapse, rather than the culmination of 3 years of careful escalating access seeking. Rosamond may not have set out from the very beginning intending anything dishonest specifically, but the cumulative pattern moved in exactly that direction, regardless of when the specific intention crystallized. And pretending otherwise would only make the next family's version of this story more likely, not less. Real protection of what a family has deliberately decided, I've come to believe, depends entirely on treating your own careful documentation with the same seriousness you'd want anyone else to treat it with, refusing to let anyone reframe a deliberate, permanent decision as casual oversight simply because reframing it feels more convenient in the moment. If a family member needs you to treat your own considered decisions as endlessly revisable based on their own preferences, that discomfort is telling you something important, and it deserves an immediate, direct response, not a patient wait and see approach. I think of it now the way I used to think about a grieving family who hadn't quite finished a difficult conversation before it became too late to have it clearly. You can wait, telling yourself there's still time. There's rarely actually as much time as you assume. It's simply a decision waiting for someone finally willing to make it plainly, while there's still room to do so honestly. I think sometimes about all those years standing beside families in their most difficult moments, learning that every honest resting place depends on a family actually deciding clearly and in advance exactly what it protects. It took me 77 years and one very serious phone call from a cemetery's own careful clerk to apply that same standard fully to my own family. I established that reservation freely, and I would establish it exactly the same way again. But I no longer accept quiet erosion of my own documented decisions as simply the price of accepting help gracefully. If I am the one who decided carefully and deliberately exactly how my own family's resting places should protect the people I love, I intend to remain the one making that decision. Not because I distrust everyone who helps me, but because pretending vigilance was ever unnecessary was never actually true. The family gathers at my own house most Sundays now, a habit that started that same spring. Simple dinners with no particular occasion required. Rosamond always asks me directly now about even small paperwork decisions that happen to come up in conversation, whether a particular approach actually reflects what I've decided, rather than assuming any decision remains open for exploration on her own initiative. Clementine flew in specially for one of those dinners that first spring, standing near my own kitchen doorway with genuine warmth on her face, watching Rosamond ask me, plainly, whether a particular update to the cemetery's own contact information actually reflected my own final decision before she said anything further about it to anyone else. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for the better part of 3 years. I am 77 years old, a widow, a retired funeral director, a mother and grandmother who still shows up for the people she loves whenever she's needed. But I am no longer a woman who quietly tolerates small, uncomfortable encroachments on her own carefully documented decisions while telling herself the people making them surely mean no real harm. That particular version of me stayed behind in an ordinary Tuesday phone call from a careful cemetery clerk, along with an unauthorized listing that nobody in this family will ever quite forget having to account for. I set down that iron that afternoon as one woman, and I picked it back up as another, and I have never once wished myself back into the first one. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently, if given the chance to go back to the day I first documented that reservation decades ago, knowing everything I know now. I tell them the truth. I would establish it exactly the same way again, because protecting my grandchildren's own future certainty was never the mistake. The mistake was assuming that careful documentation alone would naturally deter anyone determined enough to try circumventing it, that decades of clearly stated intentions could survive on their own weight, without anyone occasionally insisting they be respected directly. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the reservation I established. It would be the 3 years of small, uncomfortable signs I let slide. Signs I mistook, again and again, for ordinary family practicality rather than what they actually were. The early stages of a serious, deliberate attempt to quietly rewrite my own decisions without my consent. Clementine's own children ask me sometimes, whenever we visit the small cemetery together, why Grandma reserved certain spaces so carefully, so many years, before anyone actually needed them. I tell it every single time exactly the same way, unhurried and complete. 31 years of watching families struggle when nobody had planned clearly enough, and one deliberate decision made specifically so this family would never have to struggle that particular way. Watching them absorb a history that finally belongs to everyone who actually understands what those spaces protect. These days, when anyone in this family discusses decisions about something permanent, the actual process gets followed properly. every single time. Documentation reviewed honestly, direct conversations had plainly, no quiet shortcuts taken on anyone's behalf without their full knowledge. I'm simply, finally, exactly as certain of my own authority over my own decisions as I always should have been.